Normandy, August 12, 1944. A limestone hilltop east of a shattered French town called Mortain. A 21-year-old lieutenant lies against bare rock with a radio pressed to his chest. The set weighs 35 pounds. Its batteries are nearly dead. For 6 days and 6 nights he has barely slept. He has not been resupplied. He has not been relieved. Around him lie the dead and the wounded of an American infantry battalion, roughly 700 men who climbed this hill less than a week ago, and who are now little more than half that number. He lifts the handset to his cracked lips and speaks a string of numbers into a microphone that may no longer have the power to send them. He cannot tell whether anyone is still listening on the other end. He carries no raised rifle. He fires no shot. He is not, in the way a soldier usually understands the word, fighting at all. And yet across the previous 6 days, this one young man, with this one failing radio, has done more to wreck an entire German panzer offensive than any tank, any bazooka, or any rifleman on that hill. He has cooled down the fire of dozens of American cannon onto the roads below, again and again and again, until some of the finest armored formations the Third Reich could still field in Normandy lay burning and broken across the French countryside. His name was Robert Weiss. Almost nobody remembers it. And the reason almost nobody remembers it is, in a strange way, the most revealing part of the whole story. Because by any honest reckoning, this quiet young officer should be counted among the most consequential American soldiers of the Second World War. To understand how a forgotten lieutenant with a dying radio mattered more than the armor around him, you have to understand what was unfolding in France in the first week of August 1944. And you have to understand a decision that Adolf Hitler made over the direct objection of nearly every professional soldier who served under him. By the end of July 1944, the German position in Normandy was coming apart. For 7 weeks after the D-Day landings, the Allies had been penned into a shallow strip of coastline, grinding forward hedgerow by hedgerow at a terrible cost. Then, at the end of July, the Americans launched Operation Cobra near Saint-Lô. A carpet of bombs tore a hole in the German line. Through that hole poured the American First Army, and hard behind it came a newly activated force under the one general the Germans had learned to dread above all others, George Patton and his Third Army. The town of Avranches fell. Avranches was the hinge. It was the doorway at the base of the Normandy Peninsula through which every American tank, truck and fuel drum had to pass to spill out into the open country of France beyond. Through that single narrow corridor, Patton was funneling an entire army south and east into the wide interior. For the German commanders in Normandy, the sane response was obvious, and it was the response any competent general would have chosen. Pull back, fall back to the River Seine, save what remained of the army, and build a fresh defensive line while there was still an army left to build one with. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who commanded the German armies in the West, understood this perfectly well. Hitler forbade it. Instead, from his headquarters far away in East Prussia, Hitler looked at the map and convinced himself he saw an opportunity. Patton's army was pouring through the bottleneck at Avranches. If the Germans could gather their surviving armor and strike west, punch through the thin American line at Mortain, and drive some 20 miles to the sea at Avranches, they could slam the door shut behind Patton. They would cut the Third Army off from its fuel and its ammunition. They would split the American forces in two. They would, in Hitler's imagination, reverse the entire Normandy campaign in a single dramatic stroke. His generals were appalled. The forces Hitler wanted to throw into this attack were the very forces desperately holding the line everywhere else. To assemble them for an offensive meant stripping the defenses bare. It meant taking the last mobile reserves, the panzer divisions, and hurling them westward, deeper into a trap that was already half shut, beneath an Allied air force that owned the daylight sky. Von Kluge protested. The commanders on the ground protested. Hitler overruled all of them. The attack would go in. It was given the code name Operation Lüttich, the German name for the Belgian city of Liège, where German arms had won an early victory in the First World War, a name chosen to summon the memory of a happier campaign. The plan called for a spearhead of panzer divisions, among them some of the most feared armored formations in the entire German army. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, called Das Reich. Elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Hitler's own namesake bodyguard formation. The 2nd Panzer Division. The 116th Panzer Division. Their target, the town they had to seize and pass through on the road to the sea, was Mortain. Standing in their path was a single American infantry division that had arrived in the sector only hours before, worn down from weeks of fighting, and had barely had time to scrape out its foxholes. It was the 30th Infantry Division, a National Guard outfit built originally around men from the Carolinas, Tennessee, and Georgia, nicknamed Old Hickory, and known to their enemies, who respected them, by a darker nickname of their own. And the key to the entire battlefield, the ground that would decide whether Hitler's gamble lived or died, was a steep hill just east of the town. On the American military maps it was labeled only by its height in meters, Hill 314. Let me tell you about the man who would end up holding it, because on paper he was nobody's idea of a decisive figure in the history of the world. Robert Lincoln Weiss was born on the 4th of April 1923. He was the son of a Hungarian Jewish immigrant, a young man raised in the American Midwest, in Indiana, who had gone to Purdue University and then joined the Army in 1943 at the age of 20. When he climbed Hill 314, he was wearing the same wool serge shirt his father had worn as a soldier in the First World War. A quiet thread of family history stretched across 2 wars and 30 years. There was nothing in his background to suggest that within a year of enlisting, he would sit at the dead center of one of the most important battles of the war in the West. He was not a tank ace. He was not a paratrooper. He was not a general's son. He was trained for one of the least glamorous and least celebrated jobs in the entire United States Army. He was trained to be a forward observer for the field artillery. To understand why that job mattered so enormously and why it has been so completely forgotten, you have to understand something about how the American Army actually killed its enemies in the Second World War. The popular picture of combat is the rifleman advancing with his weapon and the tank grinding forward. But the truth, confirmed by study after study of the casualty records on every side, is that the great killer of the Second World War was artillery. Cannon fire caused more deaths and more wounds than any other weapon on the battlefield. And the American Army was better at delivering artillery fire, faster and in heavier concentration, than any other army on Earth. The reason was not a single wonder weapon. The reason was a system, and at the very front end of that system stood a single, terribly exposed human being, the forward observer. His job was to go forward, often ahead of the infantry, to a place where he could actually see the enemy. Then, with a radio and a map, he would send back the location of what he saw. Behind him, sometimes miles behind him, sat the guns and the men who performed the swift mathematics that turned his spoken coordinates into steel falling out of the sky. The forward observer was the eyes of the guns. Without him, they were blind. And to do his job, he had to place himself in the most dangerous position imaginable, close enough to the enemy to see him clearly, which meant close enough for the enemy to see and to kill him. His own antenna, jutting into the air above his hiding place, was a standing invitation for a sniper or a mortar crew to end his war. The tool that connected the observer to the guns was his radio. On Hill 314, that radio was a set the signal corps called the SCR-610. It was a battery-powered, low-power, frequency-modulated voice set, first standardized in 1941, built for exactly this purpose, to link the forward observer and the liaison officer to the artillery batteries behind them. Weiss carried it in a saddle-soaked leather case. It had a range of only about 5 miles, just barely enough to reach the American howitzers dug in to the west, and it ran on batteries. Batteries, as every soldier knew, did not last forever. Hold that single fact in your mind, because it is the thread from which this entire story hangs. Everything, the lives of 700 men, the survival of a division's flank, the success or failure of Hitler's last great gamble in Normandy, would come to hang on the fading charge in a set of radio batteries on the top of a hill. It is worth pausing to picture exactly what happened at the other end of that radio link, because it explains why one man's voice could be worth an entire artillery brigade. When Weiss spoke a target into his handset, his words did not go straight to the guns. They went to a place the American army had invented and refined in the years between the wars, a place called the Fire Direction Center. There, a small team of officers and enlisted men worked over map boards, firing tables, and specialized slide rules and plotting instruments. They took the observer's reported location of the enemy, compared it against the known, carefully surveyed positions of every friendly gun within range, and computed for each battery the precise elevation and the precise bearing it would need to drop its shells on that one spot. Crucially, they could do this for many batteries at once, batteries that might be scattered across miles of countryside and that could not see the target or one another. The center could even stagger the firing times of each battery so that shells launched from different distances all arrived at the target in the very same instant. The Americans called that technique time on target, and to the men on the receiving end, it was a horror without warning, an entire landscape erupting at once with no ranging rounds to announce it. None of this was possible without a hidden foundation of unglamorous labor. Before a single fire mission could be computed, teams of artillery surveyors had to tie every gun position and every observation post to a single common map grid, so that a coordinate spoken on a hilltop meant the exact same point on the earth to a gun crew 5 miles away. It was slow, meticulous, often dangerous work, carried out in advance and almost never remembered afterward. But it was the reason an American forward observer could call for the fire of dozens of guns and trust that the shells would land where he said, and not on his own head. The whole apparatus, the surveyors, the fire direction center, the radios, and the observer at the tip of it, formed a machine for turning information into destruction faster than any other army in the world could manage. Robert Weiss was about to become the single most important moving part in that machine, on the one hill where it mattered most. There is a bitter irony in how the 30th Division came to be standing in Hitler's path at all. After 49 days of nearly continuous combat since coming ashore, through the slaughter on the beaches and the grinding misery of the hedgerows and the ruins of Saint-Lô, Old Hickory had been promised something close to a rest when it moved into the quiet sector around Mortain. The men expected a lull. Instead, they had walked, unknowing, into the exact spot where the German army was about to hurl its last great counterstroke in Normandy. The Allied High Command was not entirely blind to what was coming. Through the secret breaking of German codes, intelligence officers had picked up fragments of warning that an attack toward Mortain and Avranches was being prepared. Late on the night before the assault, one American report even flagged the possibility of an enemy counterattack from the east or north within hours. But the warning was incomplete, and it arrived too late to do the one thing that would have mattered most, which was to meaningfully reinforce the thin infantry holding the ground before the blow landed. The men on and around Hill 314 would have to meet the panzers with what they already had. On the 6th of August 1944, the 30th Infantry Division moved into Mortain and relieved the 1st Infantry Division, the famous Big Red one, which had held the town before them. The relief was so fresh that some of Old Hickory's men barely had time to learn the ground. The 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry Regiment, under Lieutenant Colonel Eads Hardaway, drew the assignment of holding the high ground east of town. Hardaway set up his battalion headquarters down in Mortain itself and sent his rifle companies up onto the crest of Hill 314, arranging them in a rough triangle. Company K, under Lieutenant Joseph Reeser, held the north. Company G, under Lieutenant Ronald Woody, held the southwest. Company E, under Lieutenant Ralph Curley, a lanky Texan, held the east and southeast, which included the highest ground on the hill. The heavy weapons of Company H anchored the southern end. These infantrymen had rifles, a few bazookas, and mortars. Against tanks and hardened SS Panzer Grenadiers, that was not much, but they had one asset that would prove worth more than any number of bazookas. They had 2 forward observer teams from the 230th Field Artillery Battalion. One team was led by Lieutenant Charles Bartz, working with a young Texan sergeant named Frank Denius. The other was led by Lieutenant Robert Weiss. If this kind of history matters to you, the real mechanics of how battles were won and lost, and the forgotten men who decided them, take a moment to subscribe and to like this video. It genuinely helps these stories reach the people who care about them. Now, back to the hill. What Weiss and Bartz saw when they reached the summit of Hill 314 must have taken their breath away, because from a professional gunner's point of view, it was very nearly perfect. The hill was a stony escarpment about a mile long, and its highest point stood some 600 feet above the valley floor. From up there a man could see the roads unspooling below him for miles, the very roads the Germans would have to use. The main road ran west by southwest for about 8 miles to the town of Saint-Hilaire, and from there another 15 miles to Avranches and the sea. This was the road Hitler's panzers had to travel, and it lay open, in plain view, beneath the eyes of 2 young men with radios. A forward observer perched here, with enough guns behind him, could see an entire army trying to move through the landscape below, and could bury it in fire. The men spent that first day, the 6th of August, doing the unglamorous work that would prove decisive. They pre-registered their targets. This is a piece of artillery craft that sounds tedious and is in fact one of the deadliest things a gunner can do. Rather than wait for a battle to erupt and then try to calculate range and direction under fire, the observers calmly picked out the key points on the roads and crossroads below, the places an enemy would be forced to pass through, and they worked out the firing data for each one in advance. Sergeant Denius later described plotting out what he called emergency barrage numbers and normal barrage numbers, each key spot given a reference number, so that later, when it mattered, when a column of German tanks rolled into one of those marked spots, no one would need to stop and calculate. Weiss would simply speak a number, and the shells would already know where to go. They did not have long to wait. In the darkness of the early morning hours of the 7th of August, Operation Lüttich began. The German panzers rolled west out of the night, engines growling, aiming for Mortain and the road beyond it to the sea. They struck the thinly stretched American lines with the fury of men who had been told the fate of the whole Normandy front road on their success. In the dark and a thick ground fog, they overran an American roadblock on the southeastern edge of the hill. Survivors straggled back into the perimeter. Down in the town below, the Germans swept over the 2nd Battalion's headquarters and captured much of the command group, cutting the wire between the hilltop and Lieutenant Colonel Hardaway. The enemy flowed around the base of Hill 314 and pressed on westward through the fog, and for a few hours it looked as though the gamble might actually work. But up on the summit, the Americans held. And they held, in large part, because of what those 2 observers could do, even when they could see almost nothing. Around 6 in the morning, sentries reported hundreds of German troops scrambling up the eastern slope. Weiss called his first fire mission of the battle, shooting by sound and by map coordinate alone, because the fog and the darkness had blinded him. When enemy tanks and infantry slammed into Company G near a little stone church, shouting the name of their Führer as they came, Lieutenant Curley ordered Weiss to bring down fire, and Weiss did, guessing at the coordinates from the sound of the engines. Shells fell among the attackers. In a short, savage clash, the Americans threw them back off the heights. The Germans, it was said afterward, must have believed their enemy could see in the dark. By the time the morning of the 7th wore on, the roughly 700 men on Hill 314 were surrounded. The Germans had washed past and around them like a tide around a rock. The hilltop was now an island of American resistance in a sea of German advance. The men were cut off from the rest of the division. There was no easy way to bring them food, water, ammunition, or medical care, and there was no way at all to bring them fresh radio batteries. When the fog finally began to lift late that morning, the picture that opened below the hill was, for a forward observer, a target beyond imagining. Enemy troops and armor were rolling into Mortain from the east and southeast in tight formations, apparently unaware, or unconcerned, that the high ground above them was still in American hands. Lieutenant Curley, watching from the crest, wrote afterward that whether the enemy did not know Hill 314 was occupied, or simply chose to ignore it, did not matter in the slightest. What mattered was that their closed formations made a magnificent target for the guns, and the observers had spent the previous day marking every crossroad below with a number. Weiss went to work, and he did not really stop for the better part of 6 days. Command of the scattered, surrounded force on the hill soon fell to a young captain named Reynold Eriksson. In peacetime, Eriksson had been a company officer's idea of steadiness, and he was all of 24 years old. He had been down at battalion headquarters when communications died, and had fought his way back up onto the hill through the German lines, dodging enemy patrols, at one point pinned by fire from a half-track, until the men above dropped mortar rounds on it and let him crawl the last stretch to the top. Once there, he took charge of a patchwork command, Companies K, G, and E, a platoon from Company C, a squad from Company F, the survivors of Company H, and the remnants of a tank destroyer unit, all of them spread across a wide, rocky hill that made communication a nightmare. He positioned himself on the northern half, near a farm, and tried to hold the pieces together with a thin thread of radio contact and a system of runners. But the true weapon on that hill was not the rifle or the runner. It was the artillery, and the 2 men who could summon it. Every time the Germans massed to storm the crest, every time a column of vehicles tried to move on the roads below, the observers called down fire. Weiss worked one radio net for the guns of the 230th. Bartz and Denius worked the south and southwest. In all, over the course of the siege, Weiss alone called in 193 fire missions, sometimes at the rate of 1 every 15 minutes. The shells fell on the crossroads, on the assembly areas, on the tanks strung out along the narrow lanes with no room to turn. The pre-registered targets from that first calm afternoon paid off in full. Weiss did not have to calculate. He had only to speak, and from the fire direction center to the rear came back the 2 words the men on the hill came to treat, almost like a prayer. On the way. It is hard, at this distance in time, to feel how much was riding on the outcome, so it is worth stating plainly what a German success would have meant. If the panzers had broken through at Mortain and reached the sea at Avranches, they would have severed Patton's Third Army from its lifeline of fuel and ammunition at the very moment it was racing into the open country of France. An entire American army might have been left stranded and cut off, its spearheads suddenly without gasoline, and its momentum broken. The breakout that was about to liberate France could have stalled on the edge of triumph. Whether the Germans, exhausted and outnumbered in the air, could truly have held such a corridor open is doubtful, and many historians think the attack was doomed from the moment Hitler ordered it. But that is hindsight. At the time, with German armor loose in the American rear, no one on the Allied side could be sure. This was the disaster that the men on Hill 314 and the Fire 1 lieutenant called from its summit helped to prevent. The stakes on that stony crest were nothing less than the shape of the campaign for France. Consider, then, what the hill meant from the German side, and consider it carefully, because it is the heart of why that ground mattered so far beyond the 700 men standing on it. Hitler's entire plan depended on speed. The panzers had to punch through Mortain and race the 20 miles to Avranches before the Americans could react and seal the breach. Every hour of delay was fatal, because every hour handed the overwhelming Allied air forces and the gathering American reserves more time to respond. And here, sitting on the one piece of ground that overlooked every road the Germans needed, were 2 observers who could turn any movement below into a killing ground. The Germans could not advance freely along those roads in daylight without shells falling among them. They could not mass their armor for a clean breakthrough without artillery tearing the concentration apart before it could form. The hill did not merely defend itself, it reached out and strangled the movement of an entire offensive. One German officer, with grim accuracy, called Hill 314 a thorn in the flesh. When the morning fog of the 7th finally burned off completely, a second catastrophe fell on the German columns, this time from directly overhead. The sky over Normandy belonged utterly to the Allies. American fighter bombers of the 9th Air Force came screaming down on the exposed German armor jammed into the narrow roads. Squadrons of British rocket-firing Typhoons joined them, diving again and again on the tanks and half-tracks. That single day, the Allied aircraft flew hundreds of sorties over the German spearhead, and their rockets and bombs left the lanes around Mortain choked with burning vehicles. The forward observers on the hill and the pilots in the sky, working the same stretch of road from two directions, turned the German advance into a graveyard of armor. But the aircraft could only fly in daylight and decent weather. The artillery never stopped. Day and night, fog or clear, the guns kept firing, and they fired where Robert Weiss and Charles Bartz told them to fire. That was the crucial difference. Air power was a hammer that came and went with the sun. The artillery, chained to the hill by a radio, was always there. Now we come to the thing that makes this story what it is. The batteries. The radio was everything. Cut the radio, and the hill went silent. Cut the radio, and the guns went blind. The 700 surrounded men would be left with their rifles and their handful of bazookas against SS panzers, and the outcome of that fight was not in any doubt. The Germans understood this as well as the Americans did, and the cruel arithmetic of the siege was simple and merciless. The radio ran on batteries, the batteries drained a little further with every transmission, and no one could get a single fresh battery up that hill. So Weiss and his men improvised, the way desperate soldiers have always improvised. When a battery ran too low to transmit, they did not discard it. They set it out on the bare rock in the August sunlight, because a warmed battery will surrender a little more of its stored energy, just a few more minutes of precious power. They nursed the packs along, running one until it faded, switching to another, coaxing the first back to a flicker of life in the sun, always trying to keep something in reserve for the attacks that came in the dark. Every transmission was a withdrawal from an account that was nearly empty and that no one could refill. Every fire mission Weiss called was a quiet gamble that there would still be enough power left for the next one. The men on the hill were suffering terribly. They had climbed the crest with only what they could carry, and now there was no more. Water ran short in the summer heat. Food ran out. Ammunition dwindled to a trickle. Worst of all, the wounded piled up with almost nothing to treat them. There was little morphine to dull the pain, few bandages, no plasma to replace lost blood. Men lay in shallow holes, scraped in the rocky soil, bleeding and thirsty, while the shells of both armies screamed overhead. Time lost its shape. The days blurred into a single long ordeal of thirst, noise and waiting, broken only by the next German attack and the next call for fire that had to break it. The division knew the men were up there, and the division tried to help. And here the story takes on an almost unbearable quality, because nearly every attempt to relieve the hill failed. The artillery commander, Lieutenant Colonel Louis Wieman, hit on an ingenious idea. His crews took the propaganda leaflets out of hollow shell cases, packed the cases instead with medical supplies, and fired them up onto the American position. Test shots proved the concept could work, and soon other battalions were firing the improvised supply rounds too. But the violence of being fired from a cannon shattered much of what the shells carried, breaking the fragile plasma bottles and ruining the medicine before it ever reached the men who needed it. Then, late in the afternoon of the 10th of August, a dozen transport planes flew over and dropped supplies by parachute in colored canopies. It was a brave effort, and about half the bundles drifted down beyond the perimeter into German hands. The bundles the Americans did recover held some food and some ammunition, but not nearly enough of what mattered most. They did not solve the crisis of the wounded, and they did not bring the one thing the observers needed above all else. They did not bring fresh radio batteries. So the batteries kept draining, and Weiss kept calling, and the shells kept falling on the Germans below. Through the 7th, the 8th, the 9th, the 10th, and the 11th of August, the siege ground on. The Germans threw attack after attack at the hill, and the artillery broke them, again and again. Weiss and Bartz grew so practiced, so deadly, that they could work almost entirely by sound and by map when the fog rolled in and stole their vision. In the small hours of the 8th, listeners on the eastern slope caught the unmistakable clank of tank tracks moving along a road already marked for fire. The next sound was Weiss on the radio, and the sound after that was shells bursting among the tanks. When enemy soldiers infiltrated close to the summit in the dark, some of the Americans lay flat on top of their radios to smother the sound, so that the Germans crawling through the night would not hear the faint crackle of the sets and locate them. At one of the lowest points of the siege, a message was passed out over the radio, relaying the words of the men on the hill. It reported that they needed radio batteries, medical supplies, food, and ammunition. It reported that the men were holding their positions. It made a point of naming the two forward observers, Bartz and Weiss, and saying they were doing splendid work. It reported that the enemy had so far been prevented from organizing an attack of overwhelming strength. And then Weiss added into the radio the question every surrounded soldier in history has asked, whether reinforcements were coming. The Germans, for their part, understood exactly what the hill was costing them, and they decided to try with words what they had failed to achieve with tanks. Late one afternoon, an SS officer and a soldier carrying a white flag approached the American lines. One of Curley's platoon officers hurried out to meet them before they could get close enough to see anything useful about the defense. The SS officer spoke flawless English. He praised the defenders for their heroic stand. He explained at some length that their situation was hopeless, that members of the battalion command group had already been captured, that there would be no disgrace in giving up, and that their wounded would be well cared for. Then he delivered the point of it all. If the Americans did not surrender by 8 o'clock, they would be, in his words, blown to bits. The message was carried back to Lieutenant Curley. A journalist later reported that Curley had snarled a magnificent line about fighting on until the last bullet was fired and the last bayonet was buried in a German belly. Years afterward, when a senior officer asked him whether he had really said anything so dramatic, Curley admitted that he had not. What he actually said, he confessed, was short, to the point, and unprintable. Either way, the answer was no. The wounded men lying near the command post had already made their own feelings plain, calling out from their slit trenches, "Do not surrender." And the reason those exhausted, starving, half-dehydrated men could even contemplate refusing was that the radio still worked, and the guns still answered, and the enemy still could not gather to finish them without being torn apart from the sky in steel. By the 11th of August, Hitler's great counteroffensive was not merely stalled, it was dying. The panzer divisions that had set out to reach the sea had instead spent days battering themselves to wreckage against the American defenses under the ceaseless artillery and the merciless air attacks. Hitler, still refusing to face reality, ordered fresh lunges toward Avranches and demanded that the invasion front be rolled up. The generals sent to carry out these orders knew better. One senior commander, arriving to take charge of a renewed thrust with little more than a radio truck to his name, told von Kluge frankly that the task was both impossible and, in his word, unpleasant. Von Kluge himself, staring at a map with Avranches marked upon it, said quietly that this was where he would lose his reputation as a soldier. The strategic trap had closed, while the Germans hammered uselessly at the hill. By flinging his last mobile reserves westward into the Mortain attack, and by refusing for days to break it off, Hitler had shoved the German army in Normandy deeper into a noose. To the south, Patton's Third Army was racing east and then curling north toward Argentan. To the north, the British and Canadians were grinding south. The jaws of what history would call the Falaise Pocket were swinging shut around the very forces Hitler had committed to the offensive. Field Marshal Montgomery, watching the Germans pour themselves into the attack, remarked that if only they would keep attacking at Mortain a few days longer, they might never be able to get away at all. In this, the enemy obliged him, but for the men on Hill 314, the end of the siege came down, as it had from the first hour, to the radio and the fire it could still summon. In the darkness before dawn on the 12th of August, Weiss was still working. German armor was moving on the roads below, pulling back now rather than pressing forward, and he tracked it by ear and by map when his eyes could not serve, calling fire onto the retreat. Around 5 in the morning, he climbed out of his foxhole to get a clearer look at what was now unmistakably a German withdrawal. It was a decision that saved his life. Moments after he left the hole, a shell struck it, mortally wounding a fellow soldier who had shared that position with him. Weiss survived by the width of a few feet and the space of a few seconds, and then, with the last strength left in the last batteries, the observers kept firing, only now they were no longer firing on an enemy attacking the hill. They were firing on an enemy fleeing from it. The great offensive had broken, and the survivors were streaming back east, and the guns followed them as they went. The final fire missions from Hill 314 fell not on an army driving for the sea, but on the wreckage of an army trying to escape destruction. Late that morning, relief finally reached the summit. Fresh American troops climbed the hill from two directions. The 320th Infantry of the 35th Division pushed through to Company G's area around 11:30. The 1st Battalion of the 119th Infantry, part of Old Hickory's own division, made contact with Company K. By early afternoon on the 12th, the 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry was fully relieved at last. The soldiers who came up the hill found what 6 days of siege had left behind. Of the roughly 700 men who had climbed Hill 314 on the 6th of August, more than 300 were dead or wounded. The relieving troops carried the casualties down. The men who could still walk, only about 370 of them, walked down on their own feet. Among them was Lieutenant Robert Weiss, who had called 193 fire missions, who had held a radio handset to his mouth for the better part of a week, while an entire panzer offensive shattered against the fire he directed, and whose batteries, against every reasonable expectation, had lasted just long enough. The stand on Hill 314 was over. Its consequences were only beginning to be understood. Let us be precise about what those 700 men, and the 2 observers among them, actually accomplished, because it is easy to say that they were brave and to leave it there, and what they did deserves better than a vague compliment. Hitler's Operation Lüttich was designed to reach Avranches and cut Patton's army off from the rest of the Allied forces in France. It never came close. The single most important reason it never came close is that the Germans could not use the roads around Mortain freely, and they could not use those roads because the high ground that overlooked them, Hill 314, stayed in American hands, and the observers on that high ground turned every German movement into a target. The hill was a dagger held at the throat of the whole offensive. As long as it held, the panzers could not flow west in the strength and at the speed the plan demanded, and it held for 6 days. The cream of the German armored force in the end could not batter its way past a single American division that fielded fewer than 6,000 infantrymen, and a great part of the reason was the fire called down from that one stony summit. By committing his last armored reserves to this doomed lunge, and by refusing for days to call it off, Hitler delivered the German army in Normandy into exactly the encirclement his generals had feared. Within days of the failure at Mortain, the Falaise pocket closed. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured there, and the German army in the west was gutted beyond recovery. The road to Paris, and to the German border beyond, lay open. The American general who commanded the 7th Corps in that sector, Lawton Collins, later called the defense of Hill 3141 of the outstanding small unit actions of the entire war, and Omar Bradley, who led the American Army Group, regarded Hitler's decision to attack at Mortain as one of the greatest blunders he had ever witnessed, precisely because it fed the German army into destruction. The men of Hill 314 were recognized, in time. Captain Erickson and the company commanders, Byrne, Curley, Reeser, and Woody, each received the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. As for Robert Weiss, he was awarded the Silver Star. His citation records that his heroism and tireless energy were materially responsible for the trapped infantry being able to hold out against overwhelming odds. It records that he deliberately exposed himself to enemy fire, moving from one observation point to another, at times drawing that fire on purpose so that he could better direct the guns onto the enemy. He would receive the French Croix de Guerre as well, and decades later, in 2007, France would make him a member of its Legion of Honor. He was wounded later in the war, during the Battle of the Bulge. He survived that too. So here is the question that should be nagging at you by now. If Robert Weiss did all of this, if he sat at the dead center of one of the decisive actions of the Normandy campaign, if generals praised the stand he made possible as one of the finest of the war, then why has almost no one ever heard his name? The answer comes in several parts, and together they reveal something not just about one forgotten man, but about how history itself gets written, and who gets left out of it. The first reason is the nature of the battle he fought in. Mortain has been overshadowed, and it was overshadowed almost immediately by stories that were simply easier to tell. A few months after Mortain, another surrounded American force would make a stand at a Belgian town called Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge, and Bastogne became legendary, complete with a general's crisp one-word answer to a German surrender demand. Bastogne had a clean, quotable shape that a nation could take to its heart. Mortain had no such tidiness. It was fought by a National Guard division in the swirling confusion of the Normandy breakout, and it was swallowed almost at once by the far larger drama of the Falaise pocket that followed on its heels. The victory was real, but it was folded immediately into the greater triumph of the breakout, and the men who had won it were quietly pushed into the margins of the story. The second reason is the nature of the job itself. Robert Weiss was an artillery forward observer. He did not storm a beach, or plant a flag, or lead a bayonet charge up a slope. He spoke numbers into a radio. It is one of the deep injustices in how we remember war that artillery, the greatest killer on the battlefield, is also among the least celebrated of the arms, because its work is technical, indirect, and unglamorous. A man murmuring coordinates into a handset does not match the picture we carry in our heads of what a hero is supposed to look like, even when that man is doing more than anyone else on the field to decide who lives and who dies. The forward observer is the invisible figure at the center of the killing, and invisibility is not the stuff of legend. There was nothing safe about that invisibility either. The forward observer lived at the very front, and often in front of the front. To see the enemy, he had to be seen, or at least he had to risk it, perched on a crest or in a church tower, or at the lip of a ridge with his binoculars up and his antenna in the air. Both sides understood how valuable and how vulnerable such men were. An observer's position, once spotted, drew the concentrated attention of enemy snipers, mortars, and artillery, because killing him blinded a whole network of guns at a stroke. Weiss himself, by the words of his own citation, deliberately moved from one exposed post to another, and at times drew fire on purpose, accepting the risk in order to see better and shoot straighter. On Hill 314, enemy shells burst so close to him that shrapnel clipped the top of his radio antenna, and only the angle of the ground and the shelter of the great boulders kept him alive. This was the daily reality of the job, and the men who did it across every theater of the war shared it. Whole specialized units existed to locate enemy guns by the sound of their firing and the flash of their muzzles. Technical soldiers doing precise and dangerous work, whose names, as one account ruefully noted, were forgotten almost as soon as the war ended. The forward observer belonged to that same quiet fraternity of men who fought with information rather than with a bayonet, and who have been overlooked ever since, for exactly that reason. The third reason is almost accidental, and it lies in how the story was told afterward, or rather, how it was not told. The 30th Infantry Division was broken up after the war. It had no permanent home to keep its memory alive, no lasting regiment carrying its battle honors forward and repeating its story to each new generation of soldiers. Recognition that should have come swiftly came slowly, or not at all. It was not until the summer of 2020, more than 75 years after the battle, that the men who held Hill 314 received the Presidential Unit citation their stand had earned. By the time that honor was pinned on, nearly all of them were gone. Robert Weiss did something about the silence, in the only way a private citizen could. After the war, he went to law school, became a successful attorney, founded a respected firm, and built a full life in Portland, Oregon. But he never let go of the Hill. He grew troubled that the story was being told carelessly, or told wrong, or not told at all. So he sat down and told it himself. He wrote a memoir of the siege, and he built it not on faded memory, but on hard evidence. on his own after-action report, and on the actual logs of the fire missions, the very notes the Fire Direction Center had scrawled down as the shells went out. He wanted the record to exist in his own hand, accurate and complete, so that no one could shrug the story away. He drew the book's original title straight from one of the messages that had gone out from that surrounded summit, 4 words that captured exactly what it had felt like to sit on that rock with a dying radio, while the German army pressed in from every direction at once. The enemy, that message had said, was to the north, the south, the east, and the west. Robert Weiss died in 2015, at the age of 92. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, among the honored dead of the country he had served. He had lived a long life, far from the terror of that hill, and he had made sure, before he went, that the truth of what happened there would not vanish with him. There is a temptation, in telling a story like this, to shrink it down to the courage of one man, and Robert Weiss was certainly courageous. But that would miss the deeper point, and the deeper point is the thing most worth carrying away from all of it. Weiss did not blunt the spearhead of 4 panzer divisions because he was braver than other men, though he was brave. He did it because he stood at the single point where a vast and unglamorous American system of war reached out through him and touched the ground. Behind his voice on the radio stood the gun crews of the field artillery battalions. Behind them stood the Fire Direction Center, an American innovation that could take one man's spoken coordinates and, in a matter of minutes, compute firing solutions for many batteries at once, so that dozens of guns scattered across the countryside could drop their shells onto a single spot at a single moment. This was the technique the Americans called time on target, and it depended on a mountain of patient, invisible labor, on surveyors who had tied every gun and every observer to a common map grid, on good radios, and on a national economy that could pour out shells without counting the cost. Study after study, and the testimony of German soldiers themselves, agreed that in this one field, the Americans were simply better than their enemies, and that they had, in the plain words of one summary, lots of shells. From the moment a forward observer called for fire to the moment the rounds arrived was often as little as 4 or 5 minutes. Weiss was the nerve ending of that whole enormous system, the place where all of it met the enemy and became fire falling out of the sky. A German soldier looking up at that hill could not see the system. He could only feel its effects, the shells arriving out of nowhere, again and again, wherever his army tried to move. And this is what truly decided Mortain, and in a sense decided a great deal more than Mortain. The German attack was built on armor, on aggression, and on the bold initiative of gifted commanders, and the Germans were extraordinarily good at all of it. What they never managed to build, and what the Americans had quietly assembled over years of unglamorous work, was the ability to concentrate overwhelming fire almost instantly at the word of a single junior officer at the very front, wherever he happened to be and whatever he happened to see. On Hill 314, 121-year-old lieutenant became the living proof of what that ability could do. He could not stop a tank with his hands, but he could speak, and a storm would fall wherever he pointed it. The contrast between the two armies runs deeper than equipment, and it is the real lesson buried inside this story. The German soldier at Mortain was, man for man, superbly trained, and often braver than bravery should allow. German tanks were formidable, German commanders were skilled, and German tactics prized speed, surprise, and the judgment of the officer on the spot. Yet all of that excellence was aimed at winning the fight the soldier could see in front of him. The American strength was of a different kind. It lay less in any single soldier or weapon than in the invisible web that connected them, the radios, the surveyed grids, the fire direction centers, the endless supply of shells, and the doctrine that put the power to summon all of it into the hands of a young lieutenant at the front. The German way of war produced brilliant moments. The American way of war produced a system that did not depend on brilliance, only on a working radio and a man willing to use it. At Mortain, those two philosophies met on a single hill, and the system held. It held because Robert Weiss kept his radio alive long enough for the machine behind him to do its work. That is why the batteries mattered so much. That is why a set of draining radio cells, warmed on the rocks in the August sun, quietly held the fate of a battle in its charge. As long as they lasted, the 700 men on the summit were not really 700 lightly armed soldiers waiting to be overrun. They were the forward edge of a continent's worth of firepower. Let the radio die, and they were doomed. Keep it alive, even barely, even by coaxing spent cells back to life in the sunlight, and they were very nearly unbreakable. Robert Weiss kept it alive for 6 days. When everything else is stripped away, that is what he did, and it was enough to help break Hitler's last offensive in Normandy and to help open the road that led, in the end, to the liberation of France. He was a man most people never heard of, doing a job most people never think about, holding a piece of equipment most people would overlook, on a hill that most people cannot find on a map. And he helped change the course of a campaign. The tanks, the generals, and the famous divisions get the histories and the films. But on that particular hill, in that particular week, the decisive weapon was a young man with a radio and the stubborn refusal to let it die. His final missions from that summit fell on a beaten enemy in flight, and then he folded up his maps, gathered his crew, and walked down off the hill into the long, ordinary life his fire had helped to make possible for so many others. If you visit that hill today, you will find it quiet. The crest of Hill 314 is a preserved park now, and the scars of the old fighting positions still mark the rocky ground. A memorial stands there for the soldiers of the 30th Division who died on those heights, and the very outcrop where 2 young observers once sat and called down the fire that broke an army still looks out over the road below, the road the German panzers were never allowed to travel. Pilgrims once climbed this hill to catch their first glimpse of a distant abbey across the bay. Now a different kind of visitor comes, to stand where a handful of exhausted Americans held on with rifles, bazookas, and a dying radio, and would not let go. The man everyone forgot had already done the one thing that mattered most. He had made certain the guns could always find the enemy, and because he did, a division's flank held, an offensive shattered, and a door that Adolf Hitler had tried to slam shut behind an American army was instead flung open for good. If this story meant something to you, if you believe these forgotten men deserve to be remembered, then take a moment to like this video and to subscribe. Every view and every share helps carry the name of Robert Weiss and the truth of what happened on Hill 314 to someone who has never heard it. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep their memory alive.